Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Sir Alec, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I should say at the beginning that I am a shooter and a fisherman, as the Honourable Member for the Western Isles referred to, and I'm also an active farmer, so I do all those things. I am entirely opposed to this latest urban metropolitan attack on rural Britain. Merging licences would create yet more delays, more cost, more bureaucracy. Responsible gun owners are not the enemy. Let us be absolutely clear who we're talking about. We're talking about farmers, gamekeepers, sportsmen and women, and rural families. People who follow the law to the letter. People who store their firearms safely. People who undergo background checks, police scrutiny, and ongoing oversight. These are not criminals. They are among the most law-abiding people in Britain. Keeping Section 1 and 2 licensing separate recognises an important distinction in both law and practice. These systems have existed for decades, and they work. They provide proper oversight while allowing legitimate, responsible ownership. Merging them would not target criminals because criminals, by definition, do not apply for licences. They do not fill out forms. They do not submit to background checks. They do not follow the law. They do what they want. They do not care about what we say in this place. I will give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I appreciate the point he's making. But does he accept that there are instances where firearms have been lawfully obtained by people without a previous criminal record, and yet where they commit harm, particularly to themselves or someone very close to them?
Thank you, Chairman. Of course, some incidents have happened, but then incidents have happened with baseball bats, and instances have happened with other instruments which have not been banned and will not be banned. So you make a valid point, but I think it's one which needs to be looked at very carefully, because I think there are less instances than you might think. Merging licences would create more bureaucracy, as I've said, more delay, more cost, and more pressure on police licensing units that are already struggling to process applications on time while they prioritise prosecuting people for social media posts. Trust me, I understand this more than most. I had my gun seized in a late-night armed police raid following the Reform Party's false allegations about me. It took me months to get them back, months, a process based on subjectivity, which is dangerous. Despite Reform's best efforts, I remain both a shotgun and a firearm licence holder and a gun owner. Further delays would have real consequences for rural livelihoods and for a long and respected British tradition that contributes to conservation, employment, and the rural economy. Public safety is not improved by targeting those who already comply fully with the law. It is improved by focusing on illegal weapons, organised crime, and those who present genuine risk. Responsible firearm owners are not the problem. They are citizens who follow the rules, respect the law, and deserve to be treated accordingly. We should not burden them with unnecessary bureaucracy that achieves nothing except to make their lives harder. I urge the government to rethink these plans and start finally treating responsible gun owners with some respect. Further gratuitous conflict between the urban and countryside communities is an undesirable development when there is no justification to puerile legislation which is based on ideology, not common sense. Criminality with legally registered shotguns and firearms is not the issue. A malign civil service agenda is. Thank you.
chair this debate, and also congratulations to the honourable member for South Norfolk, my neighbour, for bringing forward the debate and opening it in such a measured way, which has been noted by all of us, I think. So I need to start with my declarations of interests. I own a firearms certificate as well as a shotgun licence. I believe I'm still a member of the Countryside Alliance. I haven't checked recently, but they're very good at taking the direct debit. And I also represent a rural community. Now, that's not a declaration, it's just that's what I'm here. That's my interest for being here. And in my constituency, overwhelmingly, there's a mixture of bafflement and anger. They're baffled because they can't see what the problem is that the government is trying to fix with this potential legislative change. And they're angry. They're very angry because it feels like, and I recognise it may not be the intention of the government, and I recognise we're talking about a consultation, so it's early stages, but it feels like another ignorant attack on rural communities with no proper interest as to the adverse consequences caused. Now, we've had many excellent speeches today, and I'm going to do my best not to repeat the points which have already been made. But I do want to start by acknowledging that this is a deeply emotive issue, because every death caused by a gun, or any other weapon for that matter, is in itself a tragedy. But we are legislators. It is our duty to put aside emotion and focus on the facts and take a rational approach, even if that can sometimes lead us to slightly uncomfortable and emotive responses. So let's try and do that. It is the first principle of government, when considering curbing individual liberties, that the government must have cause that the benefit sought significantly outweighs the damage caused as a result of that removal of liberty. So what is the issue here that the government is trying to solve? Well, the quick answer is public safety. But how much crime has been committed by the legal holders of shotguns? Now, of all crime, it's a vanishingly small percentage. In fact, it's 0.6 of 100,000th of 1% of crime is undertaken by legal holders of shotguns. Let's look at homicides. Homicides by legally owned shotguns, so the average over the last decade, I'm told, is 3.8 per annum. So you've got a significantly higher chance of winning the lottery than you have of being the victim of homicide by a legally held shotgun. It's about 1 in 15 million chance. Put that into context, 50 people tragically lose their lives every year because of faulty cooking appliances. 40 lose their lives because of accidents with ladders. And here we're talking about an average of 3.8 people tragically losing their lives as a result of legally held shotguns. So that's the size of the prize, reducing a long-term average of 3.8 deaths per year, reducing that down. But to what? It won't be to zero, because any system will contain a remaining risk. We would all, sensibly, we'd recognise that no system would be 100% successful other than a system that removed all shotguns from the public. And we know that even if you were successful, even if the government was successful in removing all shotguns, other forms of lethal weapon are readily available. Let's look at knives. Over 200 deaths already per annum as a result of knives. Knives are always going to be available as long as we like to cook food and eat it. So even if the government were successful in reducing the number of deaths, fatalities by legally held shotguns, it does not necessarily follow that there will be a reduction in the number of killings. So we're talking at best of a partial reduction in the number of killings from a maximum of 3.8 downwards. And yet the potential cost of the proposals that the government is considering are enormous. we've already heard from honourable and right honourable members that there will be a huge impact on the need for increased police resources. At the moment, people like myself who apply for a firearms licence, it's about 3,700 of those are renewed each year. That is a significant administrative burden on our police forces. But there are 150,000 shotgun licences which are renewed annually on average. Each one of those, even if you just look at the economic cost of the application fee, that amounts to an additional cost of £7 million, let alone the cost of the police resources. We know that many people will think the candle's not worth it and will give up shooting because it's simply too onerous. Other members have already talked about the potential loss of about 20,000 jobs of full-time equivalent and a loss to the economy of getting on for £1 billion, and I will give way.
He's giving us a fascinating perspective on the statistics. But if you were the government and you were interested in reducing the harm overall from firearms, do you think there would be greater benefit from taking all that police effort, which I think we acknowledge would go into enforcement of this wider regime, and focusing it on those firearms that are more likely to be used in crime? So smuggled handguns, converted antiques or replicas, blank firing guns that are brought in illegally. If we enforced against those, would we have a bigger impact on the number than this measure would have on the admittedly tiny number that he's talked to?
I'm grateful for the intervention. The honourable gentleman is of course right. I don't have the data. I'm trying to stick with data in this argument that I'm constructing. But the principle is a very sound one. If you focus your resources in the area where the risk is greatest, you're likely to have a better beneficial impact. The Countryside Alliance estimates that these measures will have a huge impact on the economic value of shooting to the economy. There'll be a loss of about £875 million. And for what gain? Now, this is the difficult bit, because I'm going to consider the value of a life. Of course, every life, in one sense, is priceless. But in policy terms, we do already attribute an economic value to a life. In my other job as Shadow Rail Minister, I've asked the Office of Rail and Road to give me the economic cost of a saved life on the railways. And they came back to me and they said the answer is £4 million. It's worth spending £4 million on a piece of infrastructure if over the course of its life, of its use, it saves a life. That is the rule of thumb for rail. For road transport, it's actually much less than that. Now, I'm not suggesting that every death has the same value economically, because I think as a society we'd be prepared to pay a lot more to prevent a violent murder than even a tragedy on the railway. But it's that level of magnitude is where, in policy terms, we as legislators have decided in the economic value of a life. And yet here, the government appears to be proposing a change in the law which will have an impact of several £100 million, getting on for £1 billion, in order to reduce the number of deaths from a maximum of a long-term average, 3.8, to some number less than that, but well above 0. So on any rational basis, there simply is no argument that holds water that would suggest that the price of 20,000 other people's jobs and an economic hit, particularly to the rural economy, of getting on for £1 billion in order to save a percentage of 3.8 lives over the course of a year is a credible policy position. Now, I recognise what I've said is deeply uncomfortable, because we are talking about real people, people who suffer from tragedies, and I join everyone else in my deepest sympathy for people who have been affected by this and their family or wider friends. But as a legislator, it is my duty to look beyond that. And that's why I've set out this data in order to help the minister approach this in the right way. Now, I said my constituents are baffled, but they're also angry. Because this feels like a tin-eared approach to the rural way of life. It feels like it fails to understand the community connections that bring rural communities together. It feels like a government that would propose this has no idea of who we are and how we live our lives. It feels like that the government doesn't understand, doesn't care, or perhaps it does, which would be even worse, and it disapproves of our way of life. It feels like an attack on the rural way of life without justification, an attack on the rural economy without justification. The Conservative government, has been mentioned previously, didn't consult on this proposed change of the law for a very good reason. It's because it's a terrible idea.